Halden's Reach woke up slow, the way frontier colonies always did, because there was no reason to rush when the nearest neighbor was 6 years away by transit beacon. Myra or Conqueror Voss had lived on this colony for 31 years, and she still started every morning the same way. She stood on the observation ring above the market square, coffee in hand, and counted the lights coming on in the tunnel windows below her. 62 households. 408 people, give or take the ones who'd been born or buried since the last census. Small enough that she knew every name. Small enough that when 3 lights failed to come on 40 years ago, on the night the first colonists vanished from the lower dig, everyone had known exactly whose lights those were. Nobody talked about the lower dig anymore. It was sealed, marked, and left alone, the way you leave alone a wound that healed wrong. Myra watched a delivery cart trundle across the square, its wheels catching the dust that never quite settled on Halden's Reach, no matter how many filtration cycles the colony ran. Down in the market, vendors were unfolding awnings over stalls of root vegetables and pressed mineral cakes. Someone had strung paper lanterns between 2 support struts for no reason she could think of except that it was pretty, and pretty things were worth the trouble out here. "You're doing the thing again," said a voice behind her. T.O. Aldrin climbed the last few rungs of the observation ladder and dropped onto the platform beside her, 17 years old and still not quite grown into his own hands. He'd been with her since he was 6, since the mining accident that took his parents and left him alone in a colony too small to have an orphanage, so she'd simply kept him. "What thing?" Myra said. "Counting the lights like you're afraid one's going to go out." One went out. 40 years ago. 3 of them. T.E.O. didn't answer that. He knew the story the way every child on Halden's Reach knew it, as a shape with no edges, an event everyone referenced and nobody explained. Myra had never told him the full truth of it, because she didn't entirely know it herself. She only knew what her grandmother had told her, in the last winter of her life, in a voice gone thin with something that wasn't quite fear. "The colony remembers more than we do, Myra. Be glad it forgets to tell us most of it." "You've got the Northern Relay run today," Myra said, because the morning wasn't for old stories. "Take the short crawler. The long one's still coughing." "I fixed the long one." "You said that about the water reclaimer, too." T.E.O. grinned, unbothered, and swung himself back down the ladder 2 rungs at a time. Myra watched him go, watched him cut through the market square with the easy, unhurried gait of someone who had never known anywhere else and never needed to. She envied that, sometimes. She had chosen this colony as an adult, with her eyes open, and some part of her would always be waiting for the thing that had taken those 3 families in the lower dig. She was 3 sips into her coffee when the sky alarm sounded. It wasn't loud. Halden's Reach didn't believe in loud alarms. The designers had decided, generations ago, that panic killed more people than most emergencies did. Instead, a low chime rolled across the colony speakers, patient and unhurried, the tone reserved for something new in the sky, nothing to do yet. Myra looked up. High above the dome, past the thin blue wash of atmosphere the colony had spent 2 decades cultivating, a single point of light had appeared where no point of light belonged. It wasn't moving like a star. It was moving like something that knew exactly where it was going. The ultimatum. By the time the ship made orbit, the whole colony had gathered in the square, the way people do when the alternative is staying alone with their own thoughts. It was not large, as ships went. Myra had seen images of true warships in the old trade broadcasts, vast armored things that blotted out suns. This one was sleek instead, kite in black, it hull-ridged like the shell of a beetle, moving with an unsettling, insectile precision. It settled into low orbit and simply waited there, patient as a held breath. "Concord markings," said Otieno, the colony's young comms officer, squinting at his tablet. "Scan design. I've only seen pictures." "What do the Scan want with a mining colony 400 people deep?" someone asked. Nobody had an answer, not yet. The colony's own defense grid, 3 ground batteries, a scatter of point defense drones, nothing built for war, only for the occasional pirate raider, activated on standby, more out of habit than expectation of use. The transmission came an hour later. It filled every screen in Halden's Reach at once, market boards, tablets, the big display over the transit hub. The figure that appeared was tall and narrow, its exoskeleton a deep amber, its 4 eyes arranged in a shallow arc above a mouth that didn't move when it spoke, the words arriving instead through some translation layer a half-beat behind the mandible clicks. "I am Ythis Kall, Herald-Commander of the Concord 3rd Expansion Wing. This world has been surveyed and found suitable for absorption. Your colony sits atop mineral deposits of significant value. Your defenses register as negligible. A pause, not for effect, simply because the translation needed it. You have one rotation to evacuate the surface. Resist, and the colony will be cleared by force. The transmission ended. Silence settled over the square like dust. Cleared, someone repeated. He said cleared. Like weird debris. Myra felt something old and cold uncoil in her chest. Not panic, something quieter and worse. She thought of her grandmother's voice again. The colony remembers more than we do. She turned to Otieno. Send a response. Tell him we don't intend to evacuate, and we don't intend to fight, and ask him to reconsider. Myra, that ship could. I know what that ship could do. Send it anyway. The response Ythis Kall sent back, 20 minutes later, was a single burst of laughter analog. 3 sharp clicks the translator rendered, unhelpfully, as a neutral tone marker. Then, foolish. Sentiment recorded. Rotation begins now. That night, for the first time in Myra's memory, every light in the colony stayed on. What the ground knows. Myra found TEO in the lower access corridor an hour before midnight, standing at the sealed door to the old dig with his palm flat against the metal, the way you'd rest a hand on someone's chest to feel them breathing. You shouldn't be down here, she said, though she made no move to pull him away. I keep thinking about the wiring, TEO said. The colony's wiring. It's not like the specs say it should be. I found conduit down here 2 years ago that isn't on any schematic. It's warm, Myra. All the time. Warm like it's doing something, even with nothing running through it. Myra had known about the conduit for longer than 2 years. She had known about it, in fact, since she was younger than TEO was now, since the day her grandmother had taken her down this same corridor and shown her the same warm metal and told her a story that made no sense at the time and made less sense every year since. This colony wasn't built the way the survey reports say it was built, her grandmother had told her. It was grown. Seeded from something older, something they called a loom, back before any of us were born, back when this whole sector was fighting something called the Hollow. The loom doesn't make weapons. It makes the ground remember. It learns what's trying to kill you, and it changes to stop it. That's all anyone ever told me. That's all I ever needed. There's a chamber, Myra said now, quietly, at the base of the old dig. Sealed since before I was born. Whatever's under this colony, it lives there. Teo turned to look at her, and for a moment he wasn't 17 anymore. He was the 6-year-old she'd carried out of a collapsed shaft with soot on his face and no parents left to answer to. Is that what took them? 40 years ago. I don't know, Myra admitted. I've never known. I know it's not hostile. I know it's never hurt anyone who lives here. Beyond that, she shook her head. My grandmother used to say some doors are meant to stay shut until the day they aren't. Above them, faint through a meter of rock and metal, they heard the low groan of the colony's outer shielding cycling to full charge, ready for a fight it had never once had to fight before. TEO didn't move his hand from the door. I want to be here when it opens. Whenever that is. Myra didn't answer that, not directly. She only put her own hand over his, briefly, the way you do when you can't promise someone safety but you can at least promise them company. They didn't know, standing there, that the door would open sooner than either of them believed possible, and that when it did, it would be TEO's hand on it, not hers. The first rotation. The rotation ended at dawn, and the Skarn kept their word. They did not send the full weight of their wing. Ythis Kall, Myra suspected, considered that an insult a mining colony hadn't earned. Instead, a single-strike craft dropped from orbit, black and fast, and a landing pod deployed 40 armored troopers onto the plain outside Halden's reach outer perimeter, not to negotiate, but to walk the colony's defenses and confirm, with their own eyes, how little there was to fear. Myra watched the feed from the command room with her hands folded tight enough to hurt. They're testing us, said Otieno. Reconnaissance in force. I know what it is, Myra said. Hold the ground batteries. No first shots. The troopers advanced in a loose, confident line, weapons carried low. One of them fired a single burst into the outer perimeter fence, not aimed at anyone, simply a probe, the kind of casual cruelty a much stronger force allows itself when it wants to see what happens. What happened was the fence healed. The burst tore a ragged hole through 2 meters of alloy mesh. For 3 seconds the hole simply sat there, smoking. Then the edges of the mesh began, very quietly, to move, flowing inward like something viscous finding its level, threading itself back together strand by strand until the whole was gone, leaving only a faint discoloration to mark where it had been. The trooper who'd fired froze. So did the rest of the line. Inside the command room, nobody breathed for a moment either. "Myra," Tio said, very quietly, from the console beside her. "That's not standard colony alloy. That's not any alloy I've read about." "No," Myra agreed. "It isn't." The scan line held position for almost a full minute, weapons trained on the fence as though it might do something else, something worse. Then, cautiously, they resumed their advance, and this time, when a second trooper fired, deliberately, into a support strut near the market's edge, the same thing happened. The wound closed. The strut stood. By the time the patrol withdrew back to their landing pod, they had fired 11 times into Halden's reached outer structure, and 11 times the colony had simply, patiently, put itself back together. That evening, Ythis Kall's second transmission arrived, and his tone had changed, not to fear, not yet, but to something sharper, more attentive, the voice of a hunter who has just realized the prey knows more tricks than expected. "Your defenses show unusual material properties," he said. "This does not alter the outcome. It only alters the method." A pause. The full wing descends at first light. Myra closed the channel and looked at the faces around her, frightened, but not broken, which was, she thought, the most any leader could ask of a room this small facing something this large. "They think one trick is the whole of it," she said. "Let them keep thinking that as long as they can." What the wing believed. Ythis Kall did not believe in overconfidence. He believed in evidence, and the evidence, catalogued and cross-checked twice by his own analysts, said the same thing it had said from orbit. This was a colony of 400 civilians with self-repairing but otherwise unarmed infrastructure, no orbital defense, no known allies within transit range, and no history of military conflict on any Concord record. A curious material. Not a threat. He committed the full wing at first light regardless, not out of caution, but because a Herald-Commander who let a self-mending fence delay a scheduled absorption would not remain a Herald-Commander for long. 60 strike craft descended in staggered waves. 300 troopers fanned out around Halden's reached perimeter in a formation built to overwhelm, not to test. Inside the colony, sirens sounded, not the patient chime of the day before, but the sharp, insistent tone reserved for the real thing. Myra stood at the command window and watched the black wave settle around her home like a tide coming in, and for the first time in 31 years on Halden's reach, she let herself be afraid, quietly, privately, in the 2 seconds before she had to stop being afraid in front of everyone else. "Ground batteries active," Otieno reported. "They're not enough, Myra. 3 guns against 300 troopers and 60 craft. They're not close to enough." "They were never meant to be the whole answer," Myra said. She didn't know, exactly, what the whole answer was. She only knew where it lived. The scan assault began with a coordinated strike against the colony's outer shield generators. Precise, disciplined, the kind of attack a species makes when it has learned, in one afternoon, to respect a target it underestimated the day before. 3 generators failed within the first 2 minutes. A section of the outer wall, unshielded now, took direct fire and buckled inward in a spray of debris and screaming alarms. And then it did not stay buckled. Across the exposed wound in the colony's hull, the same slow, viscous healing began. Faster now, more of it at once, threads of alloy crawling from every direction to close the gap even as fresh fire tore new holes beside it. It was not winning. It was barely keeping pace. But it was not losing either, and on the scan command channel, confusion was starting, at last, to sound like something else. "Herald-Commander," an officer reported, "structural regeneration rate is scaling with damage rate. The harder we hit it, the faster it repairs." Ythis Kall watched his own tactical display, mandibles clicking in a pattern his translator rendered as thoughtful silence. "Then we hit it harder." Beneath the colony, 300 meters down, in a corridor few people alive had ever walked, the old sealed door to the lower dig began, for the first time in 40 years, to hum. Beneath. Teo felt it before he heard it, a vibration through the soles of his boots as he ran the maintenance route Myra had ordered him to clear, the one that carried backup power down toward the colony's core systems. The tunnel walls, usually inert stone reinforced with old alloy, had taken on a faint, pulsing warmth, like something waking from a very long sleep and stretching before it opened its eyes. He should have reported it and kept moving. Instead, he stopped at the junction that led down toward the sealed dig, and stood there, and made the kind of decision 17-year-olds make when they've spent their whole life circling a locked door. He went down. The corridor Myra had shown him 3 nights before looked different now, the warm conduit along the walls glowing faintly, pale gold light pulsing in a rhythm that felt, unmistakably, like a heartbeat. At the base of the corridor, the ancient sealed door stood ajar for the first time in living memory, a hand's width of open dark beyond it. TEO's comm crackled. TEO. TEO. Where are you? The North relay's not reading your position. I'm at the old dig, he said. Myra, it's opening. It's opening on its own. There was a silence on the line that told him, more clearly than words could have, that she was already running. He didn't wait for her. Above him, muffled through meters of rock, he could feel the battle's rhythm, the deep concussive pulse of impacts, the colony's own shudder as it took blow after blow and refused, so far, to fall. Something in him, some instinct he couldn't name, told him the door and the battle were the same problem, and that whatever slept behind that door needed a reason to wake fully, not just partway. He stepped through. The chamber beyond was vast, far larger than the modest corridor had suggested, its walls lined floor to ceiling with the same pale gold conduit, all of it converging toward a single structure at the center, not a machine, not quite, more like a heart grown out of metal and light, dormant and enormous and waiting. A voice reached him, not through his comm, but through the air itself, layered and strange, neither male nor female, old in a way that made his chest ache. Blood recognized. Lineage. Or conqueror. Secondary lineage. Unregistered. State your claim. TEO froze. I don't have a claim. I'm not family. I'm just. Unregistered lineage present in this chamber for the 3rd time in 40 years. First, catalyst. Second, witness. Third, the voice paused, and in the pause TEO felt something that was almost curiosity. Third is choice. Above him, the ground shook hard enough to drop dust from a ceiling. Somewhere far up in the colony he loved, a shield generator failed with a sound like a scream cut short. I choose to protect them, TEO said, before he understood he was going to say it. Whatever that costs. I choose that. The heart of gold light surged, and the chamber's warmth became heat, and heat became something closer to fire, and TEO Aldrin, orphan of the lower dig, ward of Myra or Conquest Voss, 17 years old and terrified and certain all at once, put both hands against the structure and held on as the whole of Halden's reach began, at last, to remember what it had always been. What Halden's reach remembered. On the surface, the change did not look like victory. It looked, for one terrible moment, like collapse. Every shield across the colony flickered and died at once. The market square's paper lanterns, still strung between struts from a morning that felt like a lifetime ago, snapped their lines and scattered in a sudden hard wind that came from nowhere. Myra, sprinting down the access corridor toward the dig with her heart hammering harder than it had in 31 years, heard the command channel erupt with panic. Shields are gone, all of them, we are wide open. Hold position, she snapped, though she had no authority to promise anything. Hold, don't run, hold. And then the ground answered. It began at the perimeter, where the scan line had pushed deepest. The colony's outer wall, already scarred from hours of impact, did not simply repair itself this time. It reshaped. Alloy that had been simple hull plating folded and thickened and drew itself into new geometries, gun shapes and blade shapes and shield shapes that had never existed in any blueprint, because they had never needed to exist until this exact hour. Conduit that had run for decades as inert infrastructure carried a different current now, and every drone, every automated turret, every scrap of Halden's Reach's ordinary, unglamorous machinery came online at once, moving with a shared, silent coordination that made 300 scan troopers stop dead in their advance. On the bridge of his strike craft, Ythis Kall watched his tactical display fill with new signatures faster than his analysts could label them, and felt, for the first time in a long career, the specific dread of a hunter who has just realized the ground itself has teeth. Herald-Commander, an officer said, voice tight. The entire structure is reconfiguring. It's not a colony anymore. It's, I don't have a category for what it is. Ythis Kall did have a category. He'd only ever read about it in Concord archives so old they were catalogued as myth, a handful of frontier worlds, generations back, that had gone dark to Concord contact not because they'd been destroyed, but because whatever the survey teams found there had made further contact seem unwise. Loom worlds, the old reports called them, with no further detail, because no one who'd gotten close enough to gather detail had come back to write it. He watched 3 of his strike craft lose power simultaneously, their systems not destroyed but simply, gently switched off, the way you'd close a door on something too dangerous to leave open. He watched his ground troopers' weapons do the same, one by one, disarmed rather than annihilated, left standing confused and unharmed in a battlefield that had stopped, in the space of 90 seconds, being a battlefield at all. Not one scarred trooper died. Ythis Kall would understand, later, that this had been a deliberate choice and not a limitation, and that understanding would frighten him considerably more than the alternative would have. Herald-Commander, his second officer said, quietly, into the silence that followed. Orders. Ythis Kall stared at the colony below, its wounds already closing, its strange new geometry already softening back towards something almost ordinary, as though it had made its point and no longer needed to hold the shape. What the chamber gave back. Myra found TEO on the chamber floor, unconscious, one hand still resting against the now quiet golden structure, a thin line of blood at his temple where he'd struck the ground when his knees finally gave out. For 3 seconds that felt very much longer, she could not tell if he was breathing. He was. His pulse was fast and thready but present, and when the colony's medic reached them minutes later, his verdict was cautious relief, exhaustion, a mild concussion, nothing the boy wouldn't recover from with rest, though he added, almost as an afterthought, that TEO's reading showed a strange, faint resonance with the surrounding conduit that he had no instrument calibrated to explain. He's the third, Myra said quietly, more to herself than to anyone listening. Third what? The medic asked. Myra didn't answer. She was thinking of the 2 families lost in the lower dig 40 years ago, not devoured, she understood now, not destroyed, but taken in, the way the loom might take in anyone whose blood carried whatever old marker it was searching for, anyone it judged capable of making the choice it needed made. She thought of her grandmother's voice, worn thin with something that had never quite been fear. Some doors are meant to stay shut until the day they aren't. She would ask the chamber, later, when TEO was well enough to go back down with her. She would learn, eventually, the shape of the old war with the hollow, the reason the first colonists here had built a loom instead of a fortress, the reason it had been sealed and half forgotten rather than proudly displayed. But that was a story for calmer days. For now, she simply sat on the chamber floor beside the boy she'd raised, and held his hand, and waited for him to wake up. The recall. The Concord wing did not leave orbit immediately. For 2 full days it held position, silent, its scanners turned on Halden's reach with an intensity that felt, from the ground, less like a threat and more like an admission that no one up there understood what they were looking at. On the 3rd day, Ythis Kall requested a surface meeting. He came without escort, which Myra understood, once she saw him in person, was either enormous courage or enormous calculation, likely both. He stood a full head taller than her in the market square, amber exoskeleton catching the light through the dome, his 4 eyes taking in the paper lanterns someone had already restrung, the vendors who had reopened their stalls that very morning because life on a frontier colony did not wait long for anyone. You could have destroyed my wing, he said, through the translator, without preamble. Every ship. Every trooper. You disarmed us instead. We didn't want a war, Myra said. We still don't. You had one anyway. And you won it without killing anyone. His mandibles clicked in a pattern the translator, for once, rendered with genuine uncertainty. Why? Myra thought of TEO, resting in a medical bay with a bandage at his temple and a strange new warmth in his eyes whenever he looked toward the lower dig, as though something down there now recognized him as kin. She thought of her grandmother, and the 3 families in the old collapse, and 40 years of a colony quietly protecting a secret it barely understood, because the alternative, using that secret to conquer instead of merely to endure, had never once occurred to anyone who lived here. Because winning by killing everyone who threatens you, she said, just means you spend the rest of your life surrounded by people who wish you hadn't. Ythis Kall was silent for a long moment. Then he did something none of the colonists watching had expected. He lowered his head, a gesture his own culture reserved, Myra would learn later, for acknowledging a debt that could not be repaid in kind. The Concord 3rd Expansion Wing withdraws its claim on this world, he said. I will report it as uninhabitable for our purposes. A pause. That is not a lie, Administrator. I no longer know what this world is. I only know it is not conquerable, and I suspect it never was. Market day, again. 3 weeks later, Myra stood again on the observation ring above the market square, coffee in hand, and counted the lights coming on in the tunnel windows below. 62 households. 408 people, the same number as before, because for all the fear of those 3 days, Halden's Reach had not lost a single soul. The paper lanterns were still strung between the struts, patched now in a few places where the fighting had torn them, but still there, because some things were worth the trouble of keeping. Teo climbed the ladder and dropped onto the platform beside her, a thin scar at his temple the only visible mark of what the lower dig had asked of him. He'd been down there twice more since, on his own now as much as with her, learning the shape of the thing that lived beneath their home the way you learn the shape of a family member's silences. Concord trade envoys due in this afternoon, he said. First one since the withdrawal. Odieno thinks they want to open formal relations. Do you think that's wise? Myra asked. After everything. Teo considered it, in the unhurried way he'd always considered things, a habit she'd never managed to teach him and suspected he'd learned instead from the warm gold light in the chamber below their feet. I think, he said finally, the loom doesn't wake up for people who mean us harm. It only ever woke up because we needed it to. That's not a reason to be afraid of visitors. That's a reason to be glad of what's watching the door. Myra looked out over the market square, at the vendors unfolding their awnings, at the delivery cart trundling its familiar path through dust that never quite settled, at a colony that had almost been erased and had chosen, instead, to keep its lanterns lit. Your grandmother would have liked you, she said, without meaning to say it aloud. Teo smiled, and didn't ask which grandmother she meant, because on Halden's Reach, by now, it hardly mattered. By the time the Concord envoy shuttle touched down that afternoon, unarmed and cautious and clearly briefed on exactly how careful to be, the market square had already returned to its ordinary rhythm, vendors calling prices, children chasing each other between stalls, the quiet, stubborn hum of a small world that had been underestimated once, and had answered not with conquest, but with the simple, patient act of remaining exactly what it had always been. Somewhere beneath all of it, in a chamber few would ever see, the old gold light dimmed back down to its familiar, watchful warmth, not gone, never gone, only waiting, the way it always had, for the next door someone chose to open.